Okay, welcome everybody to this research seminar at the Institute for Future Studies. I'm very happy to have Professor Adina Preda here, who is a professor of philosophy at Trinity College, Dublin, and before joining Trinity she was at the University of Limerick, so I assume we'll have some Limericks talk today. She did her PhD in political theory, and also that's me being sloppy. I hope you could hear my starter. I'll be sloppy with the microphone. So Adina did her PhD in political theory at the University of Manchester, and where she wrote about the moral justification of humanitarian intervention. Now she is leading a 5-year research project in political philosophy called REAL, Rights and Egalitarianism, funded by ERC. And today you're going to talk about whether there can be positive human rights. The floor is yours.
That's right. Thank you, Gustav. First of all, let me just say thank you very much for inviting me here. It's very exciting to give a talk in person for the first time in ages. So I might be so excited that I'm going to lose track of what I want to say. But anyway, thank you very much. As Gustav said, the talk is about positive human rights. So that is rise to positive goods and services. And I'm going to deal with what is known in the literature as the claimability objection. There is some literature on this already. By and large, the objection says that welfare rights or socioeconomic rights, whatever we might want to call them, cannot be universal rights or general rights, you might say, or human rights, natural human rights as they are traditionally understood. I'm going to come back to all these terms and explain them in just a short while. Because the objection says these are not claimable. So if you think about socioeconomic rights such as a right to education, a right to maybe an adequate standard of living and so on, rights that are already enshrined in some legal documents, the objection says these are not rights that can be conceived as human rights are traditionally conceived, the sort of prior to their recognition in these legal documents as human rights, because of this problem with them, this problem that generalizes to all positive rights, so all rights that require an action or the provision of a good on the part of duty bearers. I forgot to ask this. I mean, if things are unclear, I'm happy to be interrupted to explain. I don't know, but that might.
People can ask questions, clarification in the chat, or put up a finger if they're in the room.
Okay.
So we handle that.
Right. Okay. Just
through me often.
Sure. Through the boss. Okay. So this is the broad kind of. A broad way of stating the objection. There are different formulations in the literature, as you can see on the slides. I've only taken a couple. So for instance, in one paper, the objection is stated as, because its correlative duties remain indeterminate in the absence of institutions to allocate them, the right to subsistence in this case, you can take any socioeconomic right really, cannot be claimable prior to the existence of the latter, that is the institutions. Another way that it was formulated, it's unclear who bears the correlative duty and hence whether anyone does. If no one has the correlative duty, then there is no right. No claim can be made. Those are some ways of stating the objection. Now maybe before moving on and getting into it, I should say something about the significance of this objection and why particularly maybe I am very exercised by it, even though, as I said, there's been some responses to it in the literature, and it's been a while since this objection was formulated. People are still writing about it, and yet there's still some interest in it, I think. Not just me, I assume. But here is why I think there is some interest in this. As I said, if this objection stands, it generalizes to all rights that require an action or the provision of a good or a service on the part of the duty bearers. So the objection wants to say, because of this feature, because socioeconomic rights are like this, they are positive rights, they cannot be universal or general. This is a big problem because I think if there are no such rights, right, prior to the institutions, then it means that they are created by these institutions, right? So states, for instance, are the typical institutions, but it doesn't have to be states. And furthermore, if we think this is not a problem with all rights, but only positive rights, in other words, if you think there might in fact be universal human rights, but only negative, so only rights to non-interference, and if these positive rights are created by certain institutions, in particular states, welfare states, they might infringe on the pre-existing rights to non-interference, right? In other words, some libertarians might be right if this objection is correct. So I'm going to try and argue that it's not correct, right? And to that end, let me go back to its original formulation. So the objection is usually attributed to Onora O'Neill, who wrote about it in several places, but I've taken some quotes from this chapter in her book Towards Justice and Virtue. This is chapter 5, in case anyone is interested. So there she says, for instance, at page 129, any right must be matched by some corresponding obligation, which is so assigned to others that right holders can in principle claim or waive the right. Further down, she says there is systematic unclarity about whether one can speak of violators, and not just contingent uncertainty about who they might be. If it's not in principle clear where claims should be lodged, appeals to universal human rights to goods and services are mainly rhetoric. These are all my emphases, by the way. And finally, she clarifies that this is not an argument to show that there can be no universal rights to goods and services. Rather, it is an argument to show what they would have to that they would have to be a particular sort of right whose counterpart obligations were distributed according to one or another institutional scheme. Hence, strictly speaking, a special right. So just for starters, I'm going to explain these terms, and I'm going to say what's distinctive about the way she formulates it. But just note that she really talks a lot about right holders being able to claim or waive the right, making claims, and so on. Okay, so now let me just give you a little bit of information about the concepts I've been using so far, right? So I was using somewhat interchangeably terms like universal rights, general rights, human rights, natural rights, and so on. Now we can be more specific. Onora O'Neill and other people talk about general rights, but in a very particular sense. So they refer to this distinction that was made by H.L.A. Hart between general rights and special rights, where general rights are basically rights that do not arise out of any special relationship or transactions, as opposed to special rights. So special rights would be the ones that are held against specific people because they arise out of this particular relationships or transactions. Of course, a common example is a contract. If you make a contract with anyone, just one party or several, that would create special rights. But there could be other types of relationships, such as special rights or duties might arise within the family, for instance, we might think. And some people might generalize that and think the nation is a family and so on, but let's not get into that. Okay, so in other words, these would be rights, as someone put it, ab initio. that are there from the beginning, which is the way we traditionally think, I think, about human rights. Rights we have just in virtue of being human. So that's one concept that comes into play a lot. The second one is this, correlativity. So we think, at least those of us who have read Wesley Newcomb Hoffeld and have been convinced by some of his analysis, but I think it goes beyond him. We think that rights have this specific feature, which is that they are relational. They actually indicate a relationship between two parties. So where there is a right, there is another party that has a duty correlative to the right. For those of you who are familiar with Hoffeld, I'm only talking about claims here, of course. I'm restricting the analysis to claims. That's all we care about. If you're not familiar, it doesn't matter, I think. Right. But what's important to know, while I think this is a common way to think about rights, especially claim rights, rights to something, it's perhaps not necessarily in the way that this correlativity thesis wants us to think about. So this is quite specific in that it says not just that there are duties that correspond to these rights, but that they logically entail each other. So in a common metaphor, there are two faces of the same coin, or maybe two ways of looking at a slope. You either look from it upwards or downwards. It's the same thing. It's just two different ways of looking at the same thing. So the correlativity axiom, as some people call it, wants to say that these are just two ways of describing the same thing, rights and duties. So they come together just looking at the same thing from a different angle, so to speak, right? Okay. So furthermore, if this is the case, we will have the same content for both the right and the duty, however specific or general that content is. Yeah, so if I have, say, a right not to be assaulted, then other people, presumably everybody, has a duty not to assault me. If I have, I don't know, a more specific right, I have a right to be given back the 10 euro I lent a friend, then my friend has a duty to give me back the 10 euro, and so on. They have to have the exact same content, the right and the duty, if that makes sense. According to, if we buy into this picture of rights, which I think many of us do, but perhaps not everybody, of course, this can be debated. Okay, so with these clarifications in mind, let me go back quickly to Onora O'Neill's objection and the way she formulated it. As I was pointing out in those quotes, she does talk a lot about enforcement. So it does seem that claimability, I mean, we might wonder what it is to claim a right. And it seems that in her picture, claimability really is about enforcement. But one thing I think she doesn't note, and we should, is that enforcement can take different forms and can come in different stages, we might think. So we might, for example, have pre-violation enforcement, right? So before a right is about to be violated, before the violation has been completed, as it were, we might either waive the corresponding duty, or we might leave it in existence and demand compliance with it, right? I mean, this often just means saying something like, you know, if I see that you're about to assault me, I just go, no, I think you should stop. I don't, I have a right against it. If, however, the violation has already taken place, Again, we might have different ways of enforcing the right in question, usually through either punishment or compensation, or both, in fact, in some cases, in a way that kind of demands restoration of that right, if that's possible. Now, if we're talking about this stage, all I want to say, if we're talking about this second stage, which Onora O'Neill doesn't make clear, on the one hand, in real life at least, and I think this is possible when we talk about moral human rights as well, this need not always come from the violators themselves. So compensation, for instance, doesn't always come from the violators themselves when they're unable to provide compensation. And of course, even in the case of negative rights, such as rights against assault or torture, for instance, you might have some unclarity about who the violators actually are. There are cases where a harm was perpetrated, a harm that you would have a right against, was perpetrated by a group of people acting jointly. And it's unclear who was in fact the violator. I don't want to get into too many details about this. I've cut some stuff from the presentation, but I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A if you'd like. So the point about this is that I don't think the focus really, as Onora O'Neill suggests, is on enforcement. If we are to talk about claimability, I guess we really want to be focusing on the pre-violation stage, right? So it's really, the problem seems to come in where we're talking about demanding compliance with the correlative duty. And why is that? Because in these cases it seems that we don't know exactly what the correlative duty requires. So that makes it more difficult in the case of positive rights, the objection would go, and perhaps we can have some sympathy with this line of thought, since without an action that takes place that we can try to stop, that would result in our violation of rights, it's difficult to say who the violators are. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that I think the focus really of the objection is on the correlativity problem. The problem is that we don't know who bears these duties and what exactly they are. It's just misnamed basically the claimability objection, but really it's about correlativity. Now, it seems like I spent a lot of time saying something quite basic, and I have. You're not wrong there. In fact, I think a lot of the people who did try to respond to the objection in the literature did notice this in a sense, right? And kind of do try and reply to this objection, to the correlativity objection. However, it seems to me that because they're not kept separate, it does get a little bit confusing when you're trying to respond to the objection, and people sometimes move between one issue and another, right, if we're not keeping this clearly in mind. And so I'll try not to make the same mistake, but who knows. Okay, so this is the objection I think we should try to respond to. And here is the objection stated more clearly, I think. Positive rights, or all rights, correlate with duties. Positive rights correlate with positive duties. In case I should say this, but if you're not interested in it, try to ignore it. I am problematically assuming here that positive rights or positive duties require an action, while negative ones require an omission. And this is debatable, I'm aware of that, but that's the assumption I'm working with in my head. Okay, the other, furthermore, the objection would say that a right against all, so a general right, which would be a right against everybody, would correlate with duties of all towards all. Yeah, that's I hope is clear. And furthermore, the objection claims that such positive duties cannot be in fact owed to all. So therefore we cannot have universal or general positive rights. Okay, so let me just very briefly talk about some existing replies to this objection. I'll give them to you in turn. So I'm following Christian Rettig in an unpublished paper as yet, who makes this, classifies them in this two different ways. Various people classify them in different ways that are not that different from each other. Sorry, that was a mouthful. Okay, so one type of response wants to say, no, you're mistaken. There are, in fact, sufficiently determinate duty bearers. It's not as bad as you might think. And furthermore, you can classify the responses under this heading as two different ones. So some people want to say the duty bearers are individuals. But there aren't many of this type, as far as I'm aware. Only Zofia Stemplovska makes or puts forward this view rather than makes the argument, I want to say. I hope none of her friends are listening. And another type of response wants to assign the duty, the correlative duties to collectives, which of course in this case would have to be the humanity as a whole, I guess, if we're talking about general rights. That, I think, for obvious reasons, or perhaps they're not so obvious to everybody, is a bit of a non-starter. I think it's dubious to claim that the whole of humanity has a duty to do something. So I don't think that's a great reply to this. But perhaps the other one, the individual duty bearers, shows some promise, and this is in fact the one I want to support and provide more argument for. So what I think happens in these responses is that, as I was suggesting, they don't in fact take correlativity very seriously. They say they do, but don't show how exactly the duties that these duty bearers would have are correlative to the rights in question. So that's what I'm going to try to do. But before doing that, let me just mention a couple of other, another type of response to the objection says that this would actually, even as moral rights, even as human rights, should be conceived basically along the lines that we conceive legal rights. So that is to say, against states. That is how we currently conceive legal human rights, as rights against states. And so they think it's the states that have these correlative duties, and that poses no problem. Now, Onora O'Neill would have an easy time with this reply. I think she kind of lost interest, so it's not like she actually replied. But one could reply and say, well, this is all very good, but this would then become, in Hart's language, special rights. Yeah, this would arise out of some special relationships or transactions. They wouldn't be the kind of general rights that we are interested in providing an argument for. So this is, I think, not a very good type of reply. There is finally, of course, I should mention this, but it's obvious, I guess, that this is not a reply to our objection. Some people might, of course, deny correlativity altogether and might say this is not the best way of conceiving of rights. We might just see them as certain entitlements that give rise to duties, but they are not, strictly speaking, correlative with duties. I can come back to this if anybody is interested. But this is not, of course, a response to the objection. And if you follow me in being interested in providing a response to the objection, then I think we need to avoid that type of line. Okay, so let me go back to it. What we've established so far, I guess, that general rights, if there are any, there might not be any, right? And by the way, I should have said this from the very beginning. All I'm trying to do in this talk or paper is to show that there could be socioeconomic rights as general rights, so that they don't sort of succumb to this objection, which is of a conceptual nature. I'm not making an argument that there are any such human rights, yeah? If there were any general rights of any kind, they would be rights against all. And the objection says they cannot be rights against all because it's just not possible. So they cannot be rights against all in a certain sense, which I'm going to come back to, because they cannot be provided to all by all. But we should note here, I think, and this is quite an important point, if we are talking about general rights as opposed to institutional rights or legal rights or something that resembles institutional or legal rights, we should not assume, I think, that they have the same structure or shape as the rights we are familiar with, right? So a right to an adequate standard of living, or a right to education, or a right to healthcare. Of course, when we think about these rights that are, as I said, enshrined in various legal documents, we assume that they require the provision of some quite sophisticated goods, a healthcare system, an education system, and so on. And these, of course, would only be sort of they can only be provided by collectives, to say the least, if not states, right? These are not, of course, goods that can be provided by individuals. However, I'm suggesting we should, if we are interested in looking at general rights, we should perhaps try and think of them in a simplified way as a kind of very thinned down version of these socioeconomic rights that we are familiar with, which might be a very complex bundle of general rights. We might be using these as a shorthand for something that is much more complex, if that makes sense. All right, okay. So here's how we, I think, could understand the idea that general rights are rights against all, which again, Onora O'Neill doesn't quite make clear, for instance. So we could first think that they're rights against each and every person in the world. In other words, there would be an indefinite number of relationships, an indefinite number of rights on this view. We could, of course, think they are rights against any person in the world, and so there would just be pairs of two different individuals, and each right would only be held against one other person. Or we could, of course, think that they are rights against all considered collectively. I previously...
Adina, can you explain the difference between A and B?
Yes, well, that's a good question. As I'm thinking of it now, there might not be a difference after all. But as I'm thinking of it now, A would, as I said, be, so it would mean I would say have a right against each of you in this room, of course, would take everybody in the world. And so there would be as many rights as there are people in this room, right? Of mine, as it were. B would sort of suggest that I would have a right, let's say, to a glass of water, right? And only one person in the room would have a duty to provide me with the glass of water. And my right to a glass of water would be satisfied if that person provided me with the glass and would be held against that person alone. So these are just different ways of conceiving it, not arguments, yeah. Okay. Right. So in the past, I made the mistake of actually trying to argue for that version, which I now think is not a very good way to go forward. Why? Well, why is there a problem with basically each of these ways of understanding it, but particularly A, which is what I want to try and support now? Well, again, we go back to correlativity. As I said, that implies that the duty and the right will have to have the exact same content. And as I already said, in cases, if we conceive of socioeconomic rights in the way we are accustomed to conceiving of them, rights to education, healthcare, and so on, these cannot be, of course, it cannot be the duty of one person to provide this type of complex good. But as I was suggesting, we needn't conceive of them in that way. We might conceive in a much more narrow and specific sense. So we might think, for example, let's say, let me go back to this example of us here in the room. It's perhaps not the best example, but it might help explain things. So say I have a right to, we're thinking I have a right to subsistence, just like everybody else. But perhaps in this kind of context where there are no institutional duties and so on, my right to subsistence just means a right to a glass of water that is either held against each of you or all of you collectively, or maybe just Gustav because it's his fault that I'm here. Or whatever. So, or perhaps I would have a right to a glass of water, maybe also a right to one of the apples over there in the kitchen in order to provide me with subsistence. And each of these would be held against each of you, let's say. All of this together, if we think of everything that comes into subsistence, would be form a complex bundle that we can think of as my right to subsistence held against each and every person. But really the general rights that we are talking about would be these more specific rights that are held against each and every person. Does that make sense? Okay, now that's the version I want to sort of put forward, not quite make an argument for it. There are further problems with that version of seeing things. And I haven't quite come up with answers for all of them, but here are some suggestions. So what I was suggesting that at least for divisible goods, right, that can be, where shares can be clearly apportioned to different people, a general right would be to a portion of this broader good. So each person in the world would have a duty to provide a portion of this good, and it would be owed to everybody. That seems quite fine to me. But some people would say, well, that's clearly a non-starter or a not a very good argument. Why? Because they say, well, if everybody would have these duties owed to everybody else, it's clearly impossible to comply with all of them. And that, even if they are minuscule, right? Even if you have a duty to provide an nth share of a good, so I don't know, maybe a loaf of bread or something. Maybe that's all you have a duty to do. Even that is impossible to provide for everybody in the world, the objection would say. Now I think this is a very different, this is true, but this is a very different kind of objection and should not be confused with the one that we are discussing here. So this is an objection about conflicts of rights or duties. This kind of objection would assume that we were obligated to perform all of these duties simultaneously, and if we can't perform them jointly, then we can't have all of them. But this asks us to, I think, buy into quite a big assumption, this particular one, that we would be obligated to perform all of them simultaneously if we have different duties. So it's not the case that we can't perform each and every single duty that we have. And so it's not the case that we don't have each and every single duty. It might be the case that we can't perform all of them taken together, but that I think doesn't necessarily show that we don't have all of those duties. Even if that's the case, other people, which I think Onora O'Neill would be one of them if she were interested, might come back and say, well, this is all very good, but ultimately it's meaningless. It's just a silly philosophical argument. But if we are interested in socioeconomic rights, which are, rights to subsistence, rights to education, and so on, having a duty to provide a minuscule portion of the good in question sort of makes a mockery of these rights, we might say. Furthermore, of course, it's not going to help in cases where the right isn't fulfilled, people might want to actually claim the object of the right. Yeah, if I am starving, it's not going to be very helpful if I say, you can go and claim one glass of water now, maybe another one tomorrow from someone else, and so on. And, even though I think we should not fall into the trap of understanding them in the way that legal systems currently understand them, I think that's quite a fair point in a way, right? However, I think this is in fact helpful. This way of seeing things is in fact helpful, because if you have a right against anyone, then it can be claimed against any person that is able to provide a portion of the good or all of the good. And in cases where they are the only person available, then they would have an obligation to provide whatever they can in order to satisfy your right. And if that comes to more than their fair share, more than they would actually have a correlative duty to do, they would be entitled to compensation from all the other people who haven't complied with their correlative duties. So I do kind of think this is a good way to see positive general rights. And here is an illustration of how I'm looking at things. So I think it helps us with the correlativity problem, but it also doesn't rule out seeing these rights as an abstract kind of rights, which is what I was suggesting earlier we would want to do. So there is no obstacle in our way of saying, well, you still have a right to education, a right to subsistence, a right to health care, but these are a bundle of very specific rights held against everybody. What is, I think, very attractive about this view is that it shows that these correlative duties would hold at all times, in the same way that they would for negative rights. So if I have a right against assault, that holds at all times, not just when I'm about to be assaulted and want to claim the right, as some people seem to suggest about positive rights. So the correlative duties understood in this way would be also duties to preempt non-fulfillment of the right. So we wouldn't have to wait for people to be hungry or sick or whatever in order to provide the good. The duties would be to make provisions in advance, as it were, so that the good will be provided. And as I said, this can, of course, translate into more complex legal rights of the kind that I suppose we are used to. It would just say that if states wanted to sort of take responsibility, as it were, and make more efficient provisions for these kinds of goods, they would simply be recognizing some pre-existing rights and duties instead of, and I'm just going back to what I was saying at the very beginning, instead of creating them afresh. And just to, I think, sort of end, let me give a further illustration of how I've been thinking about this, right? I'm thinking about this in the same way I think about having duties to my students to give them feedback. Now, maybe my picture of this is skewed because I don't have that many students. And I can deal with all of them. But those of you who do, you know, might appreciate it better and maybe even help. So, you know, we kind of have the same problem in our everyday lives, such as this, right? I take it all my students have a right to feedback, or even, you know, not necessarily feedback, I mean, not just in case they are not happy with their grade or whatever, but just further help with their studies and so on. But if they all claimed it, right? I mean, I only have about 25 students these days. So even if they all claimed it, I could probably manage. But some people have, you know, 200-300 students, right? If they all claimed it, it would be impossible to actually provide feedback to all those students. So not just, I don't just mean not feasible. If really they were to claim what they actually needed, it would probably be impossible. So we don't think for that reason they no longer have a right to feedback, or we don't have a duties owed to them to provide feedback. We deal with this in certain ways, such as we set aside time for feedback. I don't know how you do it here, but I'm supposed to give 2 hours of feedback per week, or have office hours that last 2 hours, right? The students can make an appointment during those 2 hours and get feedback, right? If I run out of time, then I don't know what happens. It hasn't happened very often. I mean, legally speaking, I don't know what happens. But I take it that the point is not that we're not I mean, of course, we're not expecting all of them to claim it. But I guess we only owe them a limited amount of our time to each of them. Fortunately, not all of them have to claim it. And so we can probably dedicate sufficient amount of time according to their needs and interests and so on. But the fact that if they were all to claim it, an nth portion of 2 hours would be meaningless, doesn't, I think, suggest that we don't owe each of them a duty to provide them with feedback, should they need it. And should, of course, this become unfeasible and so on, right? If it turns out that a lot of students need a lot of support, I guess it would come back to the employer and ourselves to say, well, this isn't a good way of arranging things. We should provide more, or I don't know. Everybody has to cut back on their other duties and so on. But this is how I'm thinking about it, and I would love to hear how you relate to this kind of example. Okay, so just to end, this is effectively my proposal without that much argument to support it, I suppose. I'm suggesting that we can understand general positive rights as rights, as very specific rights against each and every person in the world. However, this would not, I guess, be rights as some might think of them, to a certain level of well-being or to the satisfaction of certain interests and so on. They would be quite specific rights to certain goods and services that would nevertheless can be bundled into the kind of abstract right that we might be able to make easier sense of. This, I think, since it can be claimed against anyone, includes remedial duties, right? So if people have their rights unfulfilled, they can claim their rights against anybody, and this means anyone who can comply has a duty to rescue this person, we might say. But this is a duty that is one implied by their original correlative duty, not a new one, if you know what I mean. Finally, I think it's perfectly okay to owe everybody a duty. Well, I don't know if perfectly okay. I'm working on that part. But it's owing everybody a duty simultaneously, even if we can't provide the object of the right simultaneously, I think doesn't rule out having those duties. However, I do, in a sense, I mean, for those of you who don't know what Onora O'Neill was on about, her whole argument in that book, and at least in that chapter, is to convince us that we should give up the perspective of rights altogether and in fact focus on duties, and I guess more specifically in her view on duties of virtue, because this perspective of rights encourages a way of thinking she thinks is counterproductive. In a way, I want to agree with her in a very specific way. I do think we should, I mean, I don't think there is a different perspective, as I suppose I was trying to make clear. These are the same thing. Correlative duties and rights are just two different ways of talking about the same thing. But when it comes to trying to formulate the content of these rights and duties, I do think we ought to start with duties and clarify the content of those. And I'm afraid I don't have anything very useful to say here now, because I don't think you can do that without a fuller theory of justice, as opposed to just by talking about rights, as a lot of people would like to. I don't think it's possible to give content to those duties. So for that reason, I am not, in fact, as I said at the beginning, arguing here that there are such rights, and I don't know exactly what they would be, but only that they're not ruled out by this type of objection. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adina. So then we get into the question and answer period. And we have a little bit different for those of you who are participating online. We're going to use the chat function. So you just write your question, you write it in the chat. And since we are a mix of researchers from different fields and we want people to ask, we would like people from different fields to ask questions, please also write your area, your discipline. So for example, MOA sociology. We also allow for follow-up questions, so then you can write follow-up to the person you're following it up to, follow-up to Gustav, and we take those before new questions. Good, so that I would guess there are a number of questions already, and we have start out with the most eminent Ludwig Beckman. You're going to get a microphone.
Thank you. Thank you, Adina, for this talk. It was really interesting. And I just have two questions about the sort of premises, or the rather not so much on your specific solution here that you proposed. But so let me first begin by the first question then, which is that I was wondering, I mean, the question here, the claimability objection or the correlativity, as you formulated, objection that you are interested in, you put it as if it applies only to social and economic rights. And I was wondering, is it necessarily true that these positive rights are always social and economic rights? So think about, for instance, the right to vote, which is a sort of positive right. You have a right. I think Peter Jones would call that a positive right. At least he did in his rights book, and it's a right to have access to a certain procedure in a way. It's a right to be provided with a ballot paper and so forth. So it requires actions from others, and it's also, as it happens, a right that is embedded in the Universal Declaration and the Conventions of Human Rights. So that seems to be but it's not actually a social and economic right. I wouldn't call that. It's rather very typically a political right. So that would be one example of a sort of a right that is a positive right, but not a social and economic right. Another example would be rights to assistance in protection against violations of negative rights. So if I have property, for instance, a property right which typically will be a negative right, I might also have a right to assistance against violators from the police or someone else, or from my neighbors or from other people in helping me to avert those who are tempted to violate my rights. So I would just be interested to hear what you think about that possibility. And the other thing I was thinking about was if you could say something more also about what is at stake here. I mean, it seems that the easiest way out of this would be to say, to sort of buy Hart's reply. Say, well, yeah, there are special rights, all these rights. Why would that be such a deplorable solution to sort of give up the idea of general rights and to say that, well, we talk about human rights as normally they would be rights that apply to us no matter what. But in fact, we always sort of have this relationship to states or to the international community or something, and that's the source of these rights. So why can you say something? Why you think this is a what's at stake here? Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thanks. That's, quite a few things. So you're right about the first one. I think, of course, there are other rights that are not claimable in this sense. As I said, I mean, I was trying to keep the conceptual clarification to a minimum because I could go on for like quite a while with just conceptual clarifications. I was restricting myself here to claim rights for one thing, right, that correlate with duties. I guess the right to vote, I would say, is a Hoffelian power, not a claim right. It might entail certain claims against. It might be a bundle. I guess the thing is nobody would want to claim that that's a general right, as opposed that's a human right, as opposed to a civil and political right specifically against states. Although I suppose, and this kind of links with your last point, if you really wanted to argue that this is something that every person everywhere has, regardless of the political system they're in, a right to vote, you might in fact have the same problem. Unless, of course, you conceive it as a mere sort of, it doesn't make sense as some of this, as a mere power, right? That could exist without all of these adjacent duties to kind of provide the system for it, I suppose. So, and I'll come back to your second. I guess they're all related in a sense, right? Why do I know? I guess one thing I could say is this is the problem I'm interested in. It's not going to make a huge deal of practical difference. Although ultimately I'm interested in practical difference. I mean, we do live in a world of states, and those are the entities that can provide these goods currently, and should in fact provide these goods. Even if you buy into my argument, they would just be a more efficient providers of these goods that that everyone, in my view, has a duty ultimately to provide. But I guess what's at stake here is, I guess, not giving in to the libertarian assumption that all the rights we can have against each other globally are just rights to non-interference, right? And everything else, even if you bought into the assumption, of course, you could still have socioeconomic rights understood as they are today, provided that people would agree to that, right? So they would kind of be based on consent or perhaps some other type of relationship. But if that didn't happen, then there wouldn't be any such rights. And I guess ultimately I naively think that maybe even in the world as it is today, given that some states are unable to comply with their correlative duties or unwilling to, it's kind of important to suggest that actually these are duties that everybody in the world has towards everybody else, not just one's own state. But that's, yeah, a kind of naive, idealistic type of view. Did I miss anything?
No, it was just about rights to assistance. Also, if they are
Ludwig, the microphone, Ludwig.
also, if rights to assistance or protection, are they also positive? They are positive rights,
Yeah.
it seems to me. But
Yes.
so they would also sort of be vulnerable to this problem. That
Yes.
yeah.
I guess they would, yeah.
Okay, we have a follow-up from Ori Stefansson.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So yeah, this is I think a follow-up to Ludwig's question, and I'm sorry if this is not really about your sort of. This is more of a sort of clarificatory question about the background assumptions, but something that I've sort of. Well, that would be helpful for me to know as someone who's not an expert in this field. But so Ludwig was partly asking, I guess, could there be positive rights that are not socioeconomic, like the right to vote? But I was wondering, is it obvious also that all socioeconomic rights are positive rights, or I mean, is there a sort of general agreement that all socioeconomic rights are positive rights? And it seems to me that at least one way of, or one reason why one might think not, one reason that's not totally unreasonable, I guess, is that, you know, if one doesn't believe that sort of initial appropriation can ever be justified, which I don't think is a completely crazy thing to believe, at least it seems sort of hard to justify, then one might think that, you know, we all have a right to some sort of socioeconomic goods that are somehow based on the sort of negative rights of ours that you or the initial appropriators don't, or that they actually violated. So it's just, it's just a sort of general question about whether they could, for this or any other reason, we could think of socioeconomic rights as being at least partly, or some of them as being negative rather than positive.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think you're completely right. And in fact, I'm not sure there are any positive socioeconomic rights for the reasons that you just mentioned, Ori. So, like you say, assuming, say, that everybody had an initial right to an equal share of, I don't know, natural resources or all resources, yeah, and that was equally distributed. And then for whatever reason, that distribution is upset, we might think we just need to restore that equal distribution. And that would, of course, be a remedial duty that arises out of a negative correlative one, I would say, right? Now, yeah, so I like you, I think, and if you buy into that way, that kind of theory of justice, I suppose, right? It's quite hard to see where socioeconomic deprivations would come from, right? So they could come either from, you know, bad luck, things happen that kind of that upset people's fair shares or equal shares. But that, of course, would just mean we need to re-equalize the distribution. So, again, we just kind of restore people's fair share, which would, in fact, be the result of a negative right rather than a positive right. I guess they could, you know, unequal shares or Deprivations can also arise because of people's choices. So they might be, I guess, blamed for it, we might say. I don't really like that. But anyway. And in that case, I suppose that the issue really becomes relevant in that sort of case, right? And that's where you might have genuine positive socioeconomic rights that might encounter this objection. Does that help? So yeah, I'm not entirely convinced that you really need them at the level of abstract theory. But if you did, they would encounter this objection.
Right.
Happy with that, Ori? Then we go on to
Yep,
Christer.
very happy. Thanks.
Professor Byquist.
Right. Thank you so much. So I think I agree with you about the sort of dilemma situation there. That's actually far from a dilemma, because you need a lot of extra premises. For instance, you have to go from duty to ought, duty to ought, right? And also you have to sort of combine the oughts to one ought.
Right.
Yeah. But I wasn't clear about I mean, it's still true, right, that whatever I do, I will always be wronging someone. Of course, there are situations in which we have that sort of conflict, and I promise to do two things to different people, and I can't do both things. But this is special because it's just unavoidable. In every single situation, I'm wronging someone, right? And that sounds a little bit too many wrongings.
Sorry, say more. Why would be in any situation
Because your idea was that I owe it to each and everyone to give a portion of whatever is needed for them to subsist, let's say, right? And I cannot do that. I cannot satisfy all those duties too, which means that at least one of those duties to someone will be violated. And if you combine violating duties to wronging, which is the common, I guess, assumption in the literature, then I'm wronging someone unavoidably.
Yes.
Every day.
Okay, this is very helpful, because it's I think helping me to clarify an assumption I have that I wasn't quite clear before. Yes. There are people in the literature, you may know or not, who are trying to divorce rights violations from wronging. I'm not convinced, but I'm also don't really care, because I just don't see what wronging. If you think rights violations wrong somebody, I just don't see what wronging adds to it, other than something slightly rhetorical. You've wronged someone, this is terrible. I'm not committed to it either way. A rights violation is bad enough, even if you're not wronging someone, I suppose, is what I think. But I guess the assumption I have, which is starting to become clearer to me now when you were talking, is that this may be completely wrong, is that you don't need to provide even the nth portion of the good, as it were, on a daily basis to all people. That you can still owe everybody a duty. The duty is owed to everybody. That doesn't mean that the good in question has to be provided to everybody simultaneously. So I guess that's why I was bringing in that example with the student feedback. Once I've set aside 3 hours for feedback, I take it I've complied to the duty owed to all students. That's what I'm assuming. Although now I realize I don't quite have the argument for it, right? And if that proves insufficient, as I was saying, then we might need to reconsider the content of our duties and so on. And that, I was suggesting, needs to be done via a theory of justice. But, what I want to say is, once you've complied, you still owe everybody a duty, but it doesn't mean you owe everybody the actual good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not sure that what owing to means, because I would have
Yes.
thought if I owe Tim a portion, let's say a little bit of water, because he needs a glass of water to survive, then and I don't give it to him, I would say that I'm actually not complying with my duty to Tim, right? And it's also a rights violation because you have this correlation. Of course, I thought you might go in the other direction, say it's a permissible rights violation, and say that it's only impermissible rights violations that are wrongings, which is one way to go.
Oh, yeah.
But that's
no, I don't want to
don't
go
wanna
in
go
that
that way.
direction for various
Okay.
reasons.
then
But maybe it would be
yeah.
easier for me to go in that
Because
direction.
then I think I'm wronging Tim, and wronging I think has connotations or entails certain things about attitudes towards me and so on, and it has some kind of oomph, I guess, normative oomph compared to other things.
You think it has more oomph than a
Yeah,
rights
yeah,
violation? Is that
Yeah, because there can be a permissible rights violation, I think. Right.
Right. Yes, that makes sense. In that.
But
Thank you. I just, I mean, I now realize I have to support this better, but I just don't share that view, right? So if I provide 2 hours of feedback I have 2 hours of office hours, no student comes to claim feedback, I'm not wronging anyone, right? I still have a duty to each of them.
I think they might have waived, right? Implicitly.
Exactly.
Yeah, in that
The
case.
problem is when they all come there.
Yeah.
So there's coming 10 of them, and you can only give 5. So the other 5 didn't get it. Did you wrong them or not?
Yes.
You did wrong them.
If they all came and I can't provide, then I guess I did wrong them, right? Yeah.
So it's the same as Chris was talking about. Here's
But-
another
but-
way of putting the question. Do you think it's okay for morality to demand what is not possible for the agent to do?
No, but that's not my point. I mean, I'm not claiming here that morality can demand what it's not possible,
But it's
right?
not
I
possible
think
for you to give guidance to 10 students and to 5. So if they all have rights and they all come to you, it's not going to be possible for you to do what's morality
Right.
required of you.
But it's possible for me to set aside 3 hours and say you all have, I don't know what's
Okay,
3
let's
hours
change the
divided
case. So
by
let's take
10.
that
Yeah.
You just have 2 loaves of bread, and
Yes.
people need to be fed. You need to have 3.
Yeah.
So somebody's going to be wronged, and that means that you're not going to be able to do what morality requires of you. According
Yes.
to the theory,
But
you
why
defend-
is it gonna be me who's gonna wrong them if everybody else has the same
No, there's
duty?
no one else. It's just you on this island.
How many people are on this island then? I mean, if it's just 2 people, it's obviously not a problem.
No, it's just you
Yeah.
that have loaves.
Yeah.
2 loaves, but actually you need, let's take a glass of water. You only have 2 glasses of water, but there's 3 people.
There's 3
Tim,
people.
Julia, and Kristen need a glass of water.
Right.
So, and they all have a right to this glass of water, but you only have 2.
Uh-huh.
So then, according to your theory, you're actually going to wrong one of them. So you're not gonna, it's not possible for you to fulfill the demands of morality, if I understand you correctly.
Of course it's possible. I just divide the water in 3, even if
they
they're
need
just
a
2 glasses.
No. They need a full glass of water, each one of them. Don't try to get away by re-describing the case. That's not fair for me. So this is, I think, what Chris was after a bit.
Is
well,
it
not exactly, actually,
not
because
exactly,
I
no?
think there's one thing to say that if you ought to do something, morally speaking, you have to be able to do it.
Yeah.
And she's not talking about ought. She's talking about duties too. And of course, there can be situations where I promise something to you, Gustav, something to Tim, and I can't do both. But I have still a duty to each, right?
Yeah.
To do what I promised. But it's not true that I ought to do something. I mean, to promise, keep the promise to you, and ought to keep the promise to Tim, because I can't do both, right? So the step from duties to ought is a crucial one, and you deny that step. Right?
I do.
Yeah. So
That
my
I'm
point was
clear
just
on.
about that it's some unavoidably wronging going on every time, every day. Basically, I can't avoid wronging people. Sometimes, of course,
Okay,
that's
maybe
true,
I
but in your
want to
case, it's
deny that
always-
too. I
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
suppose I think that's wronging.
So
if
you
it's
understand. So what you're saying, Chris, it's not that you can do what morality requires, but you can't avoid wronging somebody.
Exactly.
And you find that counterintuitive.
If it's always like that, of course, sometimes when you make these promises to do two different people and you realize you can't do both, then of course you do wrong both people.
Yeah.
But
this is my point in a sense. Does this picture not make sense? So if I complied with my duties before anybody had to claim them, right? If everybody complied with their positive duties, the goods would be provided, right? Of course, the duties would have to be distributed in such a way as so that the goods are provided, however we conceive of them. But if everybody complied without waiting for the enforcement phase, right, with these positive duties and like set aside a fund for rainy days, then the wronging wouldn't, there would be no occasion for the wronging to take place, right? There would just be perhaps exceptional cases that we might call rescue, where something happened and there is some reason that this right wasn't fulfilled, and that would have to be claimed and could be claimed against anyone. But then the whole kind of process would take place again, and the person who were to provide more than they needed to, more than they had a duty to, would be compensated by the others.
Okay, so Tim.
So, but just to follow up on that, but Krister can't even take that first step, right? So if he owes,
I forgot what I said the first
if he
step.
owes a tiny bit of resources to everybody who needs them, he clearly can't comply with that duty. And then you said, well, it might make sense to say, if everybody, or if we kind of set things up in advance so that there was no occasion for the rights or duty violation, then we wouldn't even need to talk about that. Well, that's true, but Krister can't even do that first thing, right? I mean, what?
Because but he agrees with me that it doesn't, just because we can't comply with all of them jointly, doesn't mean that we don't have these duties, right? So we agree on that, and we're saying that's, of course you can't comply with all of them jointly if this had to be the case. It doesn't mean you don't have them.
I thought the worry was just that it turns out on your view that, or one implication of your view is that Krister and everyone in this room are wronging people all the time, and that's counterintuitive. And I got your response, and I think you made a good point, but I just don't see how it addresses this one. But I had a suggestion.
Okay, but this is much better.
But I don't think it's going to be. I don't think you're going to like it. Based on what you said in the talk, and it doesn't specify how to solve any particular problem. But I kind of like the idea that humanity as a whole has duties. And you said at some point that you thought that was just crazy or non-starter.
I used to like it, and now I'm ashamed of it.
But I didn't see why. I mean, one problem might be that you don't like collective duties in general. But so then maybe you would say the same thing about humanity having duties being absurd as you would about, say, the state having duties being absurd. But it seemed like you didn't think that. It seemed like you thought there was something specific about humanity having a duty that was absurd, and I didn't really see it.
Okay.
In fact, I find it kind of plausible.
Okay. Yeah, no, I no longer, I just, so I think only organized collectives can have duties, right? So that I do now think the duties, performing actions required by duty, does require a certain amount of agency. Even if I did also write a paper after I made that argument, I thought, okay, this is crazy, but hang on, I'll just go even crazier, and it's gonna solve the problem. I wanted to say, well, this is only a problem, the lack of agency, when it comes to what Kant might call imperfect duties, where you have to, make decisions and decide how you're going to comply with the duty, and, you have to exercise your judgment. I thought this is not a problem when it comes to correlative duties that are clearly specified. You just know what you have to do. No need for agency. This is fine. I now think that's not complying with duty, basically. I just think maybe it's possible for humanity to engage in certain actions, so to speak, but that's not complying with duty. That's just doing something, right? So that, I mean, I do think, as I said, that organized collectives can have duties as well as rights. That's not a problem. But so unorganized ones.
So maybe humanity as a whole isn't essentially organized in the way that you think the collective has to be in order to have duties. It does seem to be kind of loosely organized, though. I mean, there's some. It's kind of. It's not just a bunch of people scattered across the stars.
Oh,
right? I mean,
but by organized, I mean very organized in the way that the corporation in the way that the Institute for Future Studies in that level of organization, right?
Well, I think you're
quite high.
There,
okay, we should move on. Yeah. Joseph.
Yeah, I just had a comment on this before. I mean, the exchange before about it's in real world out there. Most of things go down like that, no? Not only in the office hours, but also the German childcare reform. So they introduced that every child has a right to a childcare spot from a certain age. And this was 2006, but we are still short. So we only have 1/3 of these places. But it does not matter because they are not used. Also, the claims are not made to such. Sometimes the claims are made and they go to court, and the court rules they are. Yeah, you're right. You have to pay a compensation or figure out a childcare spot. But if everyone would claim it, then it would be a systems collapse. But it's not that anyone is bothered by it. And the same maybe with the bank run. So the bank does not have all the money that you have paid into it. So if everyone at the same time wants to have the money, it's a mess.
Yeah.
But not everyone wants to have the money. So my question is this okay, according to your theory, that the bank does something really different with your money, and actually if you go there and want to have it back, it can't give it back to you?
Oh, I'm not sure I have a view on my bank does nothing with my money because I don't have any. I'm not sure I have a view on that, if I'm honest. But let me say something that might help about positive rights in general. So I think, obviously a lot of things work like that on the assumption that they are not claimed, right? Of course, I don't want to make this, if this depended on such a contingent thing, it would be a problem for the theory or for the argument, right? It could be the case that they are all claimed and we can't provide them. Like, this goes back, I think, to Gustav's comment, really, in a sense. And in that case, what I want to say really is, well, this is where we engage in a kind of reflective equilibrium, and where I think we need to go back and forth between our theory of rights and our theory of justice. So if it does turn out that we need more resources in order to satisfy the rights that we think we have, we just have to provide more resources, right? So if it turns out that education as it is doesn't give my students enough opportunity to, fulfill their potential and whatever, and they need more support outside the classroom, then we just need to, increase office hours and diminish the amount of teaching, or not require lecturers to do other things or whatever, right? If we think they have those rights. Or otherwise, alternatively, we might think, well, they don't have such extensive rights. Maybe all they have is a right to 5 minutes of my time, and that's that. And that's all we can give them, right? Does that help? And I don't know about the bank, though. I have no idea what banks do.
It's kind of a bit interesting, though, because it's this highly organized micro societies or whatever. I mean, where you draw the boundaries. So it's the state, it's the Institute for Future Studies, or it's the bank, and this is a bit different because it's not only operating within such a deeply confined social context that has at one point agreed on these rights by my work transnational. So it seems to me that this boundary drawing thing is really important for you. But I did not hear so much about it.
I think it might be, yeah. I mean, as ultimately, yeah, I guess the content of them is ultimately important, I suppose. But yeah, I'm suggesting that I can't provide that without a full theory. And this is maybe why we have these problems in real life as well. And we sort of talk about rights, but without specifying very clear contents, because you just can't in advance, I suppose, fully specify everything that's
next time maybe.
Where a claim can be made, yeah.
So on that note, if there's no more questions, join me and thank the speaker.
Thank you. Thank yourselves for great points.
We have
Thank you.
some talks coming up. November 10th, Eva Ehrman with the intriguing title, Artificial Intelligence and Political Legitimacy of Global Governance. And then on November 17th, we have Jan Theorell, Commitments and Bargaining Delays in Parliamentary Democracies. So we have some democracy going on. And then November 24th, Bo Rohrstein, Quality Government, Theory and Conceptualization. You're all very welcome.